Hey, welcome back. So we got cut off on the last video there. Apparently I can only go for 15 minutes. So I'm just going to finish up this last part here in part two. So when we left off, we were talking about how representation in Congress should be determined. And there's this conflict between the two major plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Eventually, Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposes what will become known as the Great or Connecticut Compromise. And it's going to establish a two-house legislature, a bicameral legislature, if you will. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is larger because it's based on a state's population. So the more population that a state has, the more representatives it would get. So Iowa, for example, we have about 3 million people, and so we have 4 representatives. Wyoming, they're pretty small, 600,000 or so population. They only get 1 representative. And California, they have around 50 million people, I believe. So they have, 50 plus representatives because of their large population. The other house, or the other chamber rather, of Congress would be the Senate. Now, in this version, this would be based more on the idea of the New Jersey plan. And for the Senate, we would have equal representation, meaning each of the states, regardless of their size, would have the same amount of senators. So Iowa has 2 senators, New York has 2 senators, Alaska has 2 senators. It's based on equality. The other big question that they had to answer was, should slaves count in the population to determine representation? Now, in the South, they definitely wanted slaves to count because this would give them more representatives in the House. The northern states, of course, weary of increased political power that the South would have with this plan, did not want this to happen. But they did want slaves to count when it came to counting for reasons of taxation, because this would mean the southern states would have to contribute more taxes. In the end, they decide again on a compromise. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states by adding to the whole number of free persons, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. Basically, what this means is that when it came to free people, they would be counted. One person is one count for representation. But when it came to enslaved individuals, only 3 out of 5 would count. We know this is the 3/5 compromise. So essentially, 3/5 of the slave population would be counted when it came to taxation and representation. We see the actual line here of all other persons. Who is that? Well, they're referring to black slaves. So immediately we have this issue of race being enshrined even in our Constitution. So when we're talking about slaves, of course, we're primarily talking about black individuals, and we're talking about them being counted as less than a free person. We are saying you are not equal to whites, enshrining this discrimination right here in the Constitution. There's also the question of slavery. What should be done about this quote unquote peculiar institution? The South, of course, considered slavery essential to their cash crop based plantation economy, and they wanted to make sure that it was preserved. The North was kind of a mixed bag. Some were okay with slavery continuing, others wanted to make it illegal, or at least make the trade of slaves illegal, if not the institution itself. And essentially, when it came to the Constitution, the Congress just, passed the buck, essentially. The only thing they really did was to agree that Congress would not interfere with the slave trade, transatlantic trade of slaves, for about a decade, until 1808. So this question of slavery is left unresolved by the Constitution, and of course won't be resolved until we get to the Civil War. Finally, when it comes to ratification, 9 out of 13 states had to ratify or approve of it at special state conventions. And immediately there develops these two factions here. There's the Federalists that supported the Constitution, supported a strong federal government, and wanted to make sure that ratification happened. Included in this were men like John Jay James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they did a lot to sell the Constitution to the states. They wrote a number of articles that have now been enshrined as important foundational documents for America that we know as the Federalist Papers. And in these, they try to explain the different parts of the Constitution and why it's going to create a good government. Now, the other faction were the anti-federalists. They opposed ratification. They were very weary of a strong centralized government, fearing that tyranny would ensue, and they opposed ratification. Now, the Federalists are going to win out, and of course the Constitution is going to be ratified. But the one, bow that they do take to the anti-federalists is to include a Bill of Rights. This was done in order to get the Anti-Federalists on board and get the Constitution ratified. All right, that's it for today. And next week, we're looking at the body of the Constitution itself to see how it tried to create a balanced government where power is divided and tyranny is prevented. I'll see you all next week.